Welcome to Kuyperian Commentary. I'm your host, Uri Brito. It's been quite some time since we've had a discussion on the podcast, but I'm very excited about reviving it in the coming months. And I'm especially excited about our co-host, Rick Davis, who will be sort of assuming this new responsibility with Kuyperian Podcasts and taking over with new interviews and new information and just a steady stream of new audio interviews coming up in the days and weeks ahead. So, Rick, welcome to Kuyperian Commentary.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Yuri. And I'm excited to be taking over and doing some interviews.
Yeah, likewise. I've been waiting this for a long time. We ended on episode 103, perfectly entitled on the Sabbath, and we did take a very extended Sabbath since our last interview. This is episode 104. Rick, just for our listeners, our new listeners, tell me a little bit about yourself, what your role is there in Virginia, if you don't mind.
So I am the associate pastor at Providence Church in Lynchburg, Virginia. And those in the CREC might know that as the church that Virgil Hurt is the senior pastor of. He's our presiding minister of counsel currently. He'll be stepping out of that role this fall. So I'm here in Lynchburg, Virginia, home of Liberty University, and where I went to college. So a really unique and nice town to see the Christian influence played out over time of someone like Jerry Falwell, who plants a college and sees it grow and spread and affect the entire community. So I'm excited about the Kuyperian ideal of every square inch taken captive to the Lordship of Christ, because I've seen a little bit of that here. And we see a picture of that in other communities that have become largely Christianized by leaders who have taken their churches in those directions.
Yeah, it's an interesting parallel. We could discuss at another time, but the parallel between the role of the moral majority and where that intersects with Kuyperian theology, because in many ways there was a lot of Kuyperian thinking among some of these guys. Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, even certainly the late Gary North was very much involved in the moral majority revolution. But it's really interesting dynamic. And so in many ways, the fruit of that moral majority, which for a lot of Republicans and certainly leftists think that was an absolute failure, but we're seeing now at Liberty, I think, in my estimation, correct me if I'm wrong, the largest Christian educational institution in the world in terms of college. Isn't that right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's the biggest in the world. And Jerry Falwell, I mean, premillennial dispensationalist guy, but he was influenced to found Liberty University and start the moral majority because he listened to lectures by Francis Schaeffer, who was entirely informed by Abraham Kuyper.
Right.
So whether he realized he was being postmillennial or not, he was. And we see the legacy of that in Lynchburg, where you have churches on every street corner. The majority of the population are Christians of some flavor or stripe. And it's a really unique place to be, unlike any I've been in before. So it gives a good picture.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm happy to be joining you on the podcast, Yuri, and kind of taking over those duties. I did want to talk to you a little bit about the history of Kuyperian Commentary, though, because I was only recently added to the group. I haven't written any articles for it. I've read a lot of them, haven't written any of them, but this was your baby. You founded it. You started it. You've been doing the podcast. Tell me a little about what prompted you to begin Kuyperian Commentary.
Well, what prompted me were primarily political interests that I had in the early days, especially if you remember, Rick, in the old Ron Paul revolution days, the glory days of political discourse. And this is way back in 2006, 2007. I began a little podcast and I was thinking through how I wanted to navigate the political concerns I had, which at that time, and to a certain extent is now a little bit transfigured, you might say, libertarian interest in terms of how to think about the limitations of the role of the government and what I perceived at the time to be a role that was assuming too much. It was becoming bloated in many, many ways, especially in the issue of foreign policy, which was a great topic of interest to me. And so I thought to myself, as my writings increased on the Ron Paul, they may be still online, some of them, as I was focusing on what Ron Paul was doing, which was taking this very strong von Mises Austrian economics and applying it to a variety of things. And I thought, well, that is really helpful, but yet it doesn't fill the kind of gap that I'm looking for in political conversations. And in those days, I had done an independent study with Professor John Frame a few years prior, but I had recently come across some other work from Abraham Kuyper. I'd worked through one of my thesis in seminary with John Frame was on Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism. And then I had come across some other political works in Kuyper dealing with the church and some of his work as prime minister and how he thought through these issues. He had written a host of essays for newspapers in the Netherlands. And as I worked through it, I thought he would be the ideal person to sort of think through these political issues more holistically from a biblical and a distinctly Trinitarian Christian perspective on things, something that Ron Paul didn't have the capacity to do intellectually. So the more I revisited Kuyper, the more I thought we need some kind of a Kuyperian approach to things. And so I chose literally the most uncommon and unsexy title for a website, Kuyperian Commentary, not because I have, not because I find myself in full agreement with Kuyper. I've talked about this in previous episodes. There's some, let's say, ecclesiastical concerns I had with Abraham Kuyper, still do, obviously. But because I think Kuyper opened the doors, he opened sort of this Narnian world so that the average Christian could look at issues regarding politics and economics and say, I think that the Bible can be applied to all these issues. I may not know how, but I do know that as a Christian, I ought to think Christianly about issues that are emerging on the political scene or the scene of entertainment and other areas of life. And so Kuyperian Commentary was birthed, and back in 2007 or 8, I believe. And I realized very shortly thereafter, as I began writing a host of topics, that the prospect of writing alone was a fairly tedious prospect. And so I thought to myself, why don't I bring some friends into the picture? And so I had some initial seminary friends that contributed, but then the more I began to add, the more it became, it grew in popularity and it grew in interest among so many people. And so I began adding different figures who at the time were unknown, like Dustin Messer, Matt Bianco, and now most folks who are in the classical school world, or at least in the Anglican community, would know these two figures quite well. So it's been sort of a labor of love beginning in 2007. And I think now we have around 20 writers. They don't write consistently, but they're in the background contributing some way or another in their scholarship to Kuyperian. And I think, to me, Rick, the most fruitful element of this endeavor that now has gone over, getting close to 13, 14 years, is that I have seen book studies, men's studies. I have seen churches quoting sections from different essays and articles we've written. That, to me, has been what has captivated me and why I have continued Kuyperian, and why I'm so excited about you taking over this role in the podcast, is because whatever we do in Kuyperian Commentary, whether we're writing about Proverbs or Kanye West, the goal for us has been, how can we help the ecclesia? How can we help the local church? Guys looking for topics of conversation, discussion. And that's where I think Kuyperian feels that need. And I'm eager to hopefully see a lot of folks using, these podcasts in the future to draw a further conversation.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting. 2007 was your starting year. In 2007, it was the first time I'd ever heard of Abraham Kuyper.
Okay.
I was at an ACCS conference. Dr. George Grant gave a lecture on Abraham Kuyper, and I'd never heard of him before.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure I wasn't alone in that. In the Reformed world, people might have been aware of him, but it wasn't a household name. I find lots of people know the name Kuyper now in just general Reformed circles that I'm in. It's a name people know, they recognize. I feel like, a lot of us were in the boat you were in 2007, and maybe even collectively, I felt like the Reformed world was going through its libertarian phase.
Yeah.
With Ron Paul and the Constitution Party, and there were a lot of libertarian leanings. Do you see that landscape still intact today, or do you feel like as a whole, sort of the Reformed world has moved in a different direction beyond that. And what would you say the role of Kuyperian commentary is in the current landscape of politics in the Reformed world?
Yeah, right. I believe very firmly that libertarianism as a system is incoherent. It can't provide a kind of a biblical rationale for much. It becomes, in many ways, applied to your standard citizens, it becomes a Wild West. Applied to the church, it becomes an absolute mess. It becomes sort of what I call ecclesiastical anarchism. It doesn't provide the kind of worldview that can be applied all through the spheres of society, so state, church, and family. And so any system that I want to apply to one sphere must be applied to the others as well. And so you can't have this incoherence. Libertarianism is not going to function in a relationship between a man and a woman. That dynamic is just not going to function well. There must be, God created a world with sun, moon, and stars, which means he created a hierarchical world. And so there ought to be certainly a ground up sort of approach to life, but there also ought to be a top down approach to life. And so the libertarian wants to make all of these hierarchies vanish. And he wants to, in many ways, sort of put a horizontal line and removing, therefore, the relationship that man has to one another in God's creation and the relationship that man has to God and the responsibilities, the ethical responsibilities we have before God and man. And so whereas the libertarian ideal can be practically romantic, in some ways, I think at its very core, its worldview essence, it fails in many, many ways, which means, for my estimation, that it's functional and it's also right and good order that society has its spheres functioning in particular ways, in ways that doesn't usurp or tyrannize other spheres, but in ways where they are able to encapsulate and embody their God-given responsibilities.
Yeah.
And so I think the reason libertarianism has sort of fallen away is because we've seen that libertarianism can lead to libertinism, and libertinism will lead to drag queen story hour at the local library. And that is a problem. And so
Yeah.
perhaps I wasn't prophetic enough to see these things unfolding, but over the years I've realized that there is good, better, best. Ron Paul was a great good, I think, in many ways, but he wasn't the best. In other words, we have to mature in some ways. Libertarianism is a wonderful way of seeing what our individual responses are, but that's where it ends. It ends in what Carl Trueman would call expressive individualism, and that expressive individualism does become, in my estimation, a violation of the second commandment. It becomes a God unto you and to society.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think the libertarian movement in the early 2000s was a reaction to seeing the federal government, the civil government, absorbing other spheres that weren't proper to it. And so the natural reaction would be, well, they shouldn't have any power at all. And the pendulum seems to have swung back a little bit, where people are realizing, as you said, drag queen story hour, transgender surgeries on little kids. Where does it stop? There's no break if you don't have a standard that you can apply all across the board. I really like what you said about the standard you have. It has to apply in every sphere. And I never heard someone quite articulate it that way. But you can't have a libertarian civil realm and libertarian families where kids are not obeying their parents because, hey, you don't have that authority over me, Dad. So I like that application. So I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about a few other things that are going on now, and I don't know what order to take them in. But the big political talking point right now in the conservative reformed world is Christian nationalism. That's a big discussion that's happening. Where do you see that as a movement in relation to your project in Kuyperian Commentary?
Well, The one difficulty that a lot that Twitter hides from a lot of these conversations is Twitter hides the personal dynamics that are invested in some of these things, right? So if you look at any of these major players, whether it be Stephen Wolfe or William Wolfe or Scott Aniol or Douglas Wilson or Daniel Strand or James Wood or Peter Lightheart, these are all people that I know really, really well at a personal level, which means I've shared meals with them. I've ridden in cars with them. And so because they're my friends at different levels, we really have to learn how to think through Twitter dialogue in a way that that affirms and honors those friendships, so that we're not talking merely to invisible humans or humans that are in some part of the world simply using their keyboard as a hammer, because we know these people, we know they have families, we know they are godly people.
Yeah.
So it's important for us to realize that the dialogues need to be shaped through those lenses first and foremost. There's time for great debate, but a lot of these men have very unique goals. They have pure goals. They're not evil. They're not ungodly. None of them have been excommunicated from their local churches, right? So we have to think through these categories. And then the second issue is there are very unique hermeneutical approaches that they all take that will automatically cause a division among interpretive bodies on issues regarding politics and its application. Scott Aniol, for example, from G3 is a premillennialist. And so premillennialism is going to have a very unique view. I tend to think that Scott is functioning very consistently with his world, and he is embodying, I think somebody wrote about this morning, he's embodying a lot of this pilgrim mentality, and that the present physical world will not receive any kind of Christendom status until it is made new by Jesus Christ. And whereas in the second coming, or as for us in the post-mill world, in the Kuyperian world, we believe that the world is incrementally evangelized, and that we have to begin to deal with these very historical and practical questions about what does it look like when 80% of the world is what does it look like when Lynchburg, Virginia has an almost completely Christian body ruling their political world. So you have to begin to ask these questions. And so I think for Kuyperian, our goal has always been much more cosmic than dealing with the United States alone. However, we are American citizens. And so the world, and I'll just end with this here, the world of Christian nationalism, the hashtag world, has been created primarily through Stephen's book published by Canon, is a world that even then has two particular hermeneutical worlds working within that bigger world. And the one is the hermeneutical world of natural law, espoused by guys like Brad Littlejohn, again, another friend, and Stephen Wolfe in the Davenant community. And then you have the world of Christian nationalism, which intends to build it through distinctly biblical moral laws, whether it be the Ten Commandments or some variegated form of the 613 civil laws. And so all of that does play a hermeneutical role.
Yeah.
And we find harmony in the way we do things. I think our goal is very similar, but we are dealing with two distinct approaches. If the folks in the natural law community look at us and say, hey, I'm willing to work with your exegesis, we can have a wonderful conversation. And then we can do the same towards the folks in the natural law world. But if the natural law folks begin to look at us as some kind of redneck exegetes that think only in categories of, if it's not explicitly stated in the Bible, that's wrong. No, we have a distinctly Westminsterian view. We're interested in natural deductions from the text. I believe, from my own perspective, I think this embodies a lot of what Kuyperian believes, that the Bible does offer a model of approaching political issues that can elevate biblical principles to the point of political conversation and discourse. Whereas they're a bit more skeptical in that regard. My desire as someone who's always intending to build bridges is to see these two worlds come together, to see, for practical purposes, the Christian case for Christian case for nationalism, Christian nationalism and mere Christendom. I want to see these worlds come together. I want to see our language be a bit more robust, originating from the Bible. But I do think these projects can be harmonized.
Yeah, I think I see the same thing myself when I look at the different camps, and I haven't read all of Stephen Wolf's book yet, so I can't comment on it. I've been chipping away for months, little by little, at it, and I'm in chapter 6. But he's speaking with a lot of appreciation for the theonomists and for their movement, and I think he even says he would love for all of the theonomists to come on board and be absorbed into his Christian nationalism project. The other side, the theonomists might say, well, we like what you're doing. We'd like you to be absorbed into our project.
Right.
But the fact that there is that willingness to say, I see what's good in what you're doing, and let's talk about it. Uh, even with natural law, you've got both sides there. The natural law guys who don't want to be ignorant biblicists, and then if you go to the other extreme, you've got the Thomas Aquinas is the devil of all modern culture and society, and every ill today can be traced back to natural law and Aquinas. So you've got those two camps. And then when it comes down to, I think, practical, okay, so what should we do? A lot of times those two camps come up with the same answer. What sorts of laws should we enact? Stephen Wolf, what sorts of laws should we enact? Douglas Wilson. And they sound a lot alike when you come down to the practical, what are we going to do? But you're right, you've got two completely different systems building behind that.
Right. And you have the other element, of course, is that with the guys in natural law and the guys in, let's call it in the biblicist world, I don't have a problem much with that language. I understand what the critiques is, but I understand what we're trying to do. We're not trying to embrace some kind of solo scriptura or nuda scriptura. We want to incorporate history into our dynamics as well. Yeah. But you're going to find it's not as objective as everybody thinks it is, right? From our perspective, we think through perspectivalism, and we understand how situations and norms and our existential world sort of functions together and harmonize the text. Well, in the natural world, you have these massive debates on how to interpret certain things. There's people debating Thomas Aquinas. There are people debating natural law. I mean, Brad Littlejohn had a series of tweets where he was thinking through what would be a natural law defense of the Sabbath as a day of rest. I said, well, and there are plenty of people replying and debating the issue. So we have to be very cautious that the idea that natural law has this concrete sense of objectivity, or that everybody on the side of the theocratic world will also agree on applications.
Yeah.
We're all wrestling with these issues, and it's very crucial that we understand there ought to be an epistemic humility, but from my perspective, to put a little bit of a just to kind of put our position a bit ahead of the game here, from our perspective, we know what authority rules all other authorities, and therefore I think we are always on safer grounds when we begin the dialogue with Genesis 1:1.
Yeah, I think you have to be on that ground too if you're going to have the dialogue. I've taught for Veritas Press online for 14 years now. It's been a long time, and for a lot of that time, I taught Aristotle as part of my yearly number of books I would go through. So, cards on the table. I have a lot of sympathy for natural law. I really liked Aristotle and his method of reasoning. But even in the ancient world, when you read a philosopher like Lucretius, who says the gods either don't exist or don't care about humans, so we need to take them out of our consideration, he gives a robust rejection of natural law in his book on the nature of things, particularly because the only grounding of natural law is a creator, and a creator who has a specific design for the world, which he rejected. And so I think even within our world, the idea of natural law as this is the common ground between believers and unbelievers is impossible, because natural law only exists if you have a creator, and then you need to know who is that creator and what is he like. And now you're back to the Bible to try to figure out who he is. So I see that as you need both sides in dialogue with each other if you're going to set up a standard. I imagine you've read Stephen Wolf's book, right?
I did. I
And
did.
I remember him saying, and I could be wrong about this, but I thought I remembered him even saying that in his conception, the content of natural law would match up with the content of the Decalogue in his view. So the two would merge in terms of what is the content of natural law. I can't
Right.
remember if it's the
No,
case.
yeah, you're right. You're right. So it's a conception that it was stated. It was not defended. It was not his goal. I will confess this here. I'm less frustrated than some people are that Stephen's goal was very much clearly indicated in the beginning of the book. This is not an exegetical project. This is in many ways assuming the exegetical project of magisterial reformers, and I'm comfortable with that. But that's the other issue too, is that my friend Brian Matson pointed out that let's say the magisterial reformers also need to be carefully selected. And Brian makes the point that Stephen was very selective in his list of scholarship. And so even there, we have to be cautious not to assume that we have the totality of magisterial reformation on the tip of our hand to quote as we please. I do think the one area I want to be somewhat clear here is that I do think that there is a valid role for the government in the promotion of the good that needs to be fleshed out more. So however we look at 13:4 in Romans, we need to be very cautious that the promotion of the good may have something to do with eliminating drag queen story hour. And at the very least, if we could find common ground there, that would be fruitful. And that is an area where I think classical liberalism has failed, certainly at its secular level, but also at its Christian level. And so we need a comprehensive world that says that, yes, some of these things can function in themselves, but laissez-faire economics viewed civilization and humanity in degrees of riches, meaning that one person's status was greater because he achieved more or made more money. But in God's world, laissez-faire economics doesn't really function that well because we're created in the image of God and we have an image-bearing status. So I think we have to consider what does it mean to promote the good from a governmental level. And that promotion of the good, primarily in my estimation, that the government's greatest promotion of good would be the defense of, the protection of the role of the church in society as the fundamental institution, as the city on the hill that allows all other institutions to function coherently. And if the government can't protect the church, COVID being a prime example of that, if the government can't protect the church, then the government ceases to promote the good at its most basic level.
So tell me why you think that aspect of Romans 13 seems to have dropped off the chart for most Christians. I think we would all agree that punishing wickedness is a role of the government. We all think that's a good thing. You want to punish murderers, you want to punish people who do bad things. But as far as the government or the magistrate being the minister of God to reward the good or to promote the good, we don't hear that talked about, even among Christians that are involved in politics. Why do you think that's dropped off the radar?
Well, probably for the same reason that when somebody comes to one of our churches, they will confuse it with Romophobia. They'll confuse it with Rome, and what I'm saying, it's a form of Romophobia, right? They have equalized. They have seen everything through the lens of that one great fear that they have, and the great fear when it comes to the government is the fear that the government is going to usurp their authority over our own freedoms, is going to take over, is going to tyrannize our conscience, for example. And so that fear, which is inbuilt in the American mindset, for the obvious reasons of our own genesis as a society, plays out quite significantly in the way we look at Romans 13. And so we are looking at a society, a governmental structure that promotes the good. And we look at that and our fear sort of takes over that premise, and therefore we remove it. Well, promoting the good means simply enacting penalties on evildoers. Well, there must be more than that. There must be more than that. And so we have to, first of all, overcome our fears. And the best way to overcome fear in any institution is to see it done well, is to see it done in a way that is patient and kind and good. And until that happens, we're going to continue to live with these fears. And I think that is the bulk of the response you're seeing to any project, let's say Christian nationalism, let's say mere Christendom, let's say theocracy, is that we fear that we could easily become we could easily be under the tyranny of a leftist government, right? Well, the reality is we're going to be under someone's authority. It could be either Joe Biden, it could be Trump, it could be anyone else. But we're going to be under someone's authority, and the idea that these governmental structures function neutrally is it's a false concept. So if we're going to be under someone's authority at some level, and we owe respect and honor, as Paul says, at that point, what is the preferred thing? And the preferred thing is that the people who enact the good through legislation, however, would have a good sense of what the good is.
Yeah. It seems like in our culture, even as you were talking, in my mind, I'm thinking of the famous C.S. Lewis quote that I don't have exactly, where he said a tyranny that's exercised sincerely for the good of the governed is the most terrible kind of tyranny there is. You're probably familiar with it, and you might even know the quote better than me, because he's thinking of sort of the nanny state that wants to take care of everybody. And we saw that with COVID, right? The government has to promote public health and public good. And so you have all the COVID rules, the mask rules, the restrictions, the stay-at-home orders, and we reacted against that strongly. We don't want that. Is it possible that, just spitballing here, but is it possible that it's because our idea of the good as a society has become material good, physical health, physical wealth, versus the spiritual good that we should see in society? We want people to be just and good people. We want them to be Christians. We want them to serve the Lord. That's why the church needs to be protected. That's why the church needs to be fenced by the government to protect it from overreach. Do we have those two competing ideas of the good in society today?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And this goes back to the conversations about that you're familiar with in the classical world, conversation about what is virtue, and can a society function through a virtuous premise? This brings up, of course, a very controversial question about, is it better to live in a cultural Christianity that is not entirely, fully, quote unquote, regenerate, or do we prefer some kind of neutral, classical liberal world in which everybody's free to do their own thing? Well, now, as for people who live in the South, we know that there's a lot of nominal Christianity here in the South, but we also know that it is infinitely better, from my perspective, to walk into a Panera Bread and see people talking, greeting one another, loving one another with good Southernisms, reading their Bibles at the table, praying before a meal, even if they go to church once a quarter. That is a much better environment than the environment that we see when I do conferences in Oregon or California, where that doesn't prevail at any level. And so that conversation, of course, brings up issues of the role of what covenant entails. What does it mean to be in the church and outside the church? But I think we have failed to grasp that there are basic goods in society that are better than the lack thereof, and that we ought to treasure these basic goods, and that sometimes we take for granted these basic goods. We take for granted the fact that there are prayers before certain things that happen, that there are intrinsic rights even within our laws, our constitutions, that belong to a religious society. And that's a good thing. So unless the church leads the way in producing virtue among its citizens and its own members, it's going to be hard for society to come alongside. So there ought to be a cultural endeavor at that level. So the dilemma that's usually posed is, well, you want to see a government completely operating from a Christian premise without a society or civilization that's not Christian. I said, no, there's no reason why those two ought not to function together. In fact, if the church is functioning as we do through word and sacrament and ministry, discipleship, and prayer, the kind of citizen we'll be producing will be the kinds of citizens we'll want to see all of these areas transformed.
I think in a conversation I was in with a fellow yesterday, we were talking about the three uses of the law classically
Yes.
in Reformed theology. You've got the evangelical use of the law that convicts you of sin, that brings you to repentance and brings you to the Lord. And you've got the civil use of the law, which is the law of God applied to culture to restrain evil. It seems like in our Christian world, that use of the law has disappeared because that is cultural Christianity, right? We're going to enforce a Christian code of conduct that might not convert you. It might not make you a Christian, but it is going to prevent drag show story hour for the kids at the library.
It will.
And that's better than if you're going to have unbelief either way, it's better to have unbelief restrained by law versus unbelief running rampant everywhere.
That's exactly right. I think I made reference to this before, but it's not so much that I oppose the idea of one Christian king or one Christian prince, is that if you want to use sort of federalist language, I think we ought to have 50 Ron DeSantis. Each state's going to differ, but we have to begin incrementally the way we think about these issues. And so a lot of people think that the Christian nationalists, and my involvement in that, you may know a little bit of, is that I just have a lot of friendships. I've met Yoram Hazony, so I've participated in the National Conservative Conference. But my involvement is not so much that I want to see a Christian prince tomorrow, but my involvement is that we ought to have ideals and goals from which we begin our conversation. And every Christian should desire to have Christian neighborhoods. Every Christian should desire to have Christian nations. And so that at that local level, I think is where the battle begins. At the same time, that does not prevent you from saying, therefore, 100 years from now, this is where we ought to be.
Yeah. So I want to steer the conversation a little bit here just to maybe bring us to an ending point. We've been kind of sprawling over a lot of ground here, and that's
great
probably
topic
good, because if I'm going to be taking over the podcast and interviewing people, it's good to have this big picture of everything that's out there, right? Every square inch of creation. I want to talk about sort of one aspect that's been controversial within the Christian nationalism debate, and that's its relation to kinism. And the reason I want to talk to you about that is because I preached through the book of Jonah this past year in my church.
Wonderful.
And I used your commentary, the commentary you and Rich Lusk wrote, heavily. I thought it was really great. But in that commentary, you spend a good bit of time talking about nationalism, Jonah's issue with the fact that he didn't want to see Assyria blessed, because that would, he knew, mean ultimate judgment for his nation, because his nation was living in rebellion to God. He knew that if he preached to the people of Nineveh, they would repent and God would relent and give them a reprieve. And that would, he could see which way the wind was blowing. He could see that there was ultimate destruction in the future for his unbelieving countrymen. And he didn't see God's plan to ultimately preserve his people through this other pagan nation. So you talk a lot about how your nation can become an idol, and you published that 2-3 years ago. It's been a couple years at least, I think, probably 3 years since you were writing it, 2 years since you published it, before this Christian nationalism conversation started. So it was almost, I think, a good sort of bit of prophetic writing in advance of the debate that we see about kinism sort of within that world. Bringing it around to a question for you, what dangers do you see within the Christian nationalism movement as far as kinism? I think all the main players would say they're not. But then when you get into the social media world, a lot of their followers are embracing that title or loving that title. So what do you do? What do you say to the guy who says, I want a Christian nation and I love my people, I love my kin, I want I want Virginia to be a Christian nation. And because of that, I don't want even Christians moving into Virginia from outside. I want us to be Virginians for Virginians as Christians. I want to limit, you know, anybody from moving in and joining us and changing our ethnic culture. What would you say to that? Or
Right.
what's your take on that?
Yeah, well, a few thoughts here. I think that the nature, let's say, the project that Kinism intended to bring forth was a project that had its origin in the early 2000s, and there are some. It's in many ways it's a reformed variation of this conversation about distinctions. And R.J. Rushdoony was somewhat involved with it, though I don't think he was the one who coined the term. The term came a little bit later after his death. But one of the concerns that was brought forth in the kinist world, which is probably in many ways probably as small as it's much smaller than most people realize. But the concern about that is that God sort of ordained separation of races in all areas of life, and that separation of races has practical applications into our local communities. Some of them will talk about the danger of even interracial marriage. And that becomes obviously really personal for me because I'm from South America and my wife is from North America. And so these issues become personal very quickly. They very quickly abandon the world of abstract. They are applied very quickly to distinct scenarios in the lives of people we know quite well. So obviously I'll be against that premise. I think that the rationale of biblical history is a rationale that removes any kinist premise. And the rationale of biblical history is a rationale of moving from infancy to maturity. And part of the infancy of, let's call it the early church, which is the days of Israel, right? The early, the Abrahamic church, how the Mosaic, however you want to phrase that language here. But the rationale for that was that Israel maintained certain, let's say, theological and national boundaries for a particular reason. The reason for that was so that it could be preserved as a nation among many, was so that the nations outside of Israel could look, as Deuteronomy says, look with jealousy upon Israel's laws and say, boy, I really wish we had these laws. They are so right. They are so good. They provide such coherence in society. And so there's initial purpose for it. But as history moves along, we can begin to see that there are hints in what God's intentions are in and through Israel, that Israel serves not as one that is unmoved by her geographical boundaries, but Israel serve as one that will eventually break the geographical boundaries. And because they had dwelt in such a unique world, covered by God's presence, the Shekinah glory, that transition from infancy to maturation was hard for many people. It was hard for the prophets of northern Israel, for sure. It was hard for a man like Jonah. However, what God was trying to do, even through that very unique situation in Jonah, was to begin to break those assumptions that Israel had about what their role was before the nations. And their role was to fulfill the promise given to Abraham, that from Abraham, the nations would spring forth and be as numerous as the stars in the skies and sand in the seashore. And so Jonah was fighting many personal things. Among them was a shepherding tendency that we all have as ministers, you and I have, which is to protect our people from what he perceived to be a threat, namely the Assyrians. But the other one was he was fighting a theological transition in history, which personally, as you know, Rick, many of us would fight as well. Yeah. Many of us would fight any major transition we're going through our lives, which is why a lot of our transitions don't happen overnight. They take time, they take conversation. Jonah is wrestling with personal pastoral issues, but also in understanding by faith what God was trying to do in history in that time, which is to move Israel from glory to glory. And that moving from glory to glory meant that the glory of Israel is now to be shared among the nations, which means that the premise of distinctions is in many ways meant to be eradicated at a theological level. At a theological level. We can talk about some practical familial issues, but even there, I think that ought to be eradicated as well. I think Jesus eradicated that in some ways. But that's something to keep in mind as we move, is that Jonah and Israel struggled with that. And we, looking at this issue now, are many in the Kennist world are attempting to relive the struggles of Jonah, but not move from glory to glory, but remain in the initial glory of Israel, which was never intended to be isolated.
So what would you say to the argument then that if we're to baptize and disciple the nations, teach them to obey Christ, that presumes that there are nations, that there are ethnoi that are being discipled? And I know one argument is if you don't keep those boundaries, you no longer have ethnoi. You know, you've got the argument that it's all cosmopolitanism, globalism, this sort of big mash of people who are all just a homogenous unit versus distinct nations that are glorifying the Lord. So, I mean, that's one argument I've heard. I'm interested in how you would respond to that from the global perspective of the churches spreading and filling the earth.
Right. So there are a couple of angles I want to approach this here. And I always try to look at these issues from sort of unique angles. That's my John Frame influence. I don't want to offer just cliche answers to these issues here. So life provides, as Exodus chapter 30, life provides different zones. There are zones, let me phrase this way. There are liturgical zones for the Christian at home, liturgical zones in the government, liturgical zones in the church, liturgical zones in society. In other words, every element, every angle, every unique sphere provides its own fragrance or incense. And there are certain areas where that incense ought not to be joined together, because if you get a coalition of incenses, that can provide a lot of allergic reactions, you might say. So you want to keep spheres relatively in their own place, because fragrances are unique to that place. And that's why the church has its own incense. In Exodus chapter 30, the altar, there's an altar of incense in Exodus chapter 30, which doesn't appear in individualized Israelite homes, right? So the incense of the church. So there are different zones. When we think through these issues, what I'm saying is that individual nations will preserve a certain culture, and that culture ought to be good and ought to be true, because it's going to reflect that. However, that culture submits to a theological culture that is universal. So in my case, let's just use stereotypes, right? If we can use it with the Cretans, we can use it with Brazilians too. The stereotype would be that Brazilians are always passionate, right? So if you spend a day in northeastern Brazil, you're going to see a lot of people who are very animated about life in general. They love life. They love music. They love soccer. They have distinct interests. Those cultural interests are preserved because there are unique people born in a unique place. God placed them there uniquely, as Acts 17 says. God determined their own spaces, and that's okay. Those cultural elements need to be preserved. The laws that preserve those cultural elements need to be preserved. It's important that the people preserve those cultural elements. However, they are always submissive to bigger theological cultural issues, which means that because we're in Brazil, it doesn't mean that we get to establish our own liturgical norms in church life. They submit to Leviticus chapter 9. They submit to the book of Revelation. They submit to biblical principles the Apostle Paul establishes. But they're going to come with unique flavors. They're going to come with unique incenses, unique fragrances that are distinct. And a lot of that is the danger in a lot of these conversations that everyone has assumed that the theological culture and the national culture is one and the same.
Mm.
And I don't think they are. I think they're different zones of life in submission to the order and structures of the temple. Certainly the Torah was that way. And so those two issues have to be preserved. There's always going to be some conflict between these two. But what we do know ultimately is that the altar of incense is preeminent over all, over all ethnoi.
Yeah.
That's something to keep in mind. But the other practical element, of course, is that language. So from my perspective, I would think that immigration policies ought to function on the basis of theological culture. And that theological culture ought to come in and provide an impetus, a motivation for the current national cultures. So I would never want to do away with the 4th of July as a Brazilian person.
Yeah.
I want to come along and say, how can we make this 4th of July even more Christian, How can we treasure what happened in American history in a way that preserves its beauty, but also its Christian virtues within it? So what we don't want is an open immigration policy that completely secularizes the 4th of July.
Mm.
We don't want to see that happening. I think that's a great danger, which is why I think policies ought to be framed first and foremost in the preservation of theological culture above everything else.
I like that. That leads me to a couple of ideas here, and I don't know how long we have for this interview. We might need to wrap up soon, but I'm enjoying the conversation.
Oh, me too.
It,
Give your thoughts, and we can close here. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on that. I said a lot.
So my question here is, as you're talking, it sounds almost like this is a point of departure between sort of the two kingdom thinking and Kuyperian sphere thinking, or zones, as you're talking about them, in the sense that, at least in the two kingdom thinking, the classic two kingdom thinking I've seen, the church doesn't have its own culture. That's the earthly kingdom that has the culture. The church is there to help you get to heaven. The church is there to help you deal with spiritual things, but the physical things of life, which include your culture and your ethne, so to speak, is all in the earthly kingdom. Versus what you're articulating, which is that the church has a culture. It's a sphere of authority. The nation has a culture. They're in interaction with each other, and your commitment to the church is a higher commitment than to your particular political or ethnic nation. The two are both there. They're both spheres. You should honor both, but one gets honored higher than the other. Would I be right in saying that's kind of what you're articulating here?
Yes, and I'm not speaking so much of no, and you made a good distinction there. Of course, we're not talking about the two kingdom sort of world brought up by Escondido, California. We're talking about your classical reformational, which is essentially in many ways a dichotomy between the internalization of religion and the externalization of religion, and the two sometimes don't mix. And I am obviously much more comfortable with that premise than what we see in Escondido, which is a deformation, I think, of the relation between the church and the state, or the church and culture. And so from that perspective, as I look through these issues here, I am saying specifically that the church is the preeminent culture. And the church is, according to Ephesians, from where the wisdom of God comes from. It comes from that. The church is the only culture that is called upon, exhorted to enter into its gates with thanksgiving and praise. And so if we're going to put in these categories, I think the church, I think if I'm going to just make a categorical sort of assertion here, I think thanksgiving is how the church reacts towards culture, and praise is how the culture reacts within its own culture. So thanksgiving would be externalizing the praises of Yahweh, and praise would be what happens within the realm of the worship of God's people. So anyway, I think the culture of the church ought to be preeminent for several reasons, among them because it is the only eternal institution right? The state and the family shall cease in its normal fashion. And it's the only institution that has been given the keys of heaven and hell, of the kingdom. And it's the only institution that shall not be prevailed by the gates of hell. And so that alone sort of establishes the church as a primary institution, which means that the culture of the church is the only way that families and states can breathe properly in this world. If you remove the role of the church, then the state can't breathe, nor can the family. They're going to function in a very dysfunctional manner, which is what happened for 2+ years in the United States and around the world. And so now the church is coming out of that, and now those priorities have been out of order, which has allowed the state to take a much more leftist and a much more totalitarian approach to things. And now those of us who saw this fighting, this taking place, we're reasserting ourselves in society. But a lot of the other churches are very, very easily seduced by every wind of doctrine, by wokeist ideology, because when you don't exercise your liturgical muscles through a long period of time, they do atrophy. And when you work through that, at the end of it, you end up being disoriented and you don't know what your role is in society anymore. So the church is going through a discombobulating era, and only those who believe in the centrality of the church are going to be able to reassert our role in establishing our culture as primary.
I've heard people say that COVID has been a great blessing to the church overall because of the reshuffling of priorities. Even here, I've seen, and
Yeah.
you've experienced this as well, churches that stayed open during COVID have grown by leaps and bounds and are flourishing. Churches that shut down are shrinking and dying away. And so you really have a dividing line almost between the people that saw church as this is a central part of my life. This is important. This is my priority. Um, and I think God is reshuffling the church in that way. So I'm excited to see where that goes in
Yeah.
the upcoming years. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, God has been gracious in preserving our churches through this season, and He's given us a lot of energy and, in some ways, boldness and courage to essentially say, bring it on. What's next?
Yeah.
We've learned a lot of lessons. This is great, Rick. I've really
This
enjoyed
was
my
fun.
time.
Yeah. Thanks for giving me this time and spending so much of your time to talk to me here. I've enjoyed it. And maybe at some point down the road, you can pop back on from time to time and I can give you some more specific directed topical interview time. But it was fun to kind of sprawl and talk about the whole gamut of the political landscape today and where we are as Christians. And I'm looking forward to starting some more of these interviews. So
Yep.
looking forward to
Sometimes,
the future of Kuyperian Commentary podcast.
amen. Amen. These back porch conversations without notation sometimes are the best.